Imagine a world where filth was the very air your child breathed. The dust in their home was made of dried animal dung, street refuse, and ash. From their first breath, a medieval child's lungs were under constant siege by this toxic grime, making a simple cold the first step toward a fatal pneumonia. Their environment wasn't just dirty, it was a biological weapon, and their immune system was born on the losing side of the war. Hello and welcome. Before you close your eyes and get cozy, make sure to subscribe and like the video, and let me get you to sleep flawlessly. Chapter 1. The Unseen Siege of Childhood. To understand the fragility of a medieval child's life, one must first dispel the romances of chivalry and castle grandeur. Those stories belong to the very few. For the vast majority, life was not a tapestry of heraldry and quests, but a sustained, low-grade negotiation with forces that were both invisible and omnipresent. The world into which a child was born was not merely difficult or austere. It was, in a very literal sense, hostile. From the moment of first breath, the infant entered a state of siege. The siege was not conducted by armies with banners, but by environments. It was a siege waged by the air, which was considered in the medical understanding of the time to be capable of corruption. A miasma of bad smells from stagnant water, from tanneries, from the open middens where refuse was piled. This bad air was thought to carry disease directly into the body. And while the theory was wrong, the observation was correct. Where there was filth, there was sickness. The child's world was one where the boundary between the home and the refuse heap was porous, where animals and humans shared living spaces, and where the very dust was composed of dried manure, ash, and decay. This environmental siege was compounded by a biological one. The medieval body, at any age, was a landscape inhabited. Intestinal parasites, roundworms, whipworms, tapeworms, were not rare infections. They were a near-universal condition. They were contracted effortlessly from contaminated soil, from unwashed food, from water sourced downstream of where people lived and relieved themselves. A child's small body became a host. These parasites did not typically cause dramatic, swift deaths. Instead, they enacted a slow, draining occupation. They consumed nutrients meant for their host, leading to a state of chronic malnourishment even when food seemed sufficient. They caused abdominal pain, diarrhea, and a lethargic weakness. They stunted growth. Chapter 2. A Statistical Shadow over the Cradle. We speak of averages and numbers, of life expectancy hovering somewhere between 30 and 35 years. But an average is a mathematical ghost, a number that tells a story true for almost no individual. It is pulled down, profoundly and soberingly, by the sheer weight of mortality in the first years of life. To say life expectancy was 30 is not to say people withered at 30. It is to say that the journey from birth to adulthood was a gauntlet, and many never made it to the other side. The figures are soft, gleaned from parish records, skeletal analyses, and manorial rolls, but they whisper a consistent, grim truth. It is estimated that perhaps a quarter to a third of all children born would die before their first birthday. Another significant portion would perish before they reached the age of 5. By the time a cohort of children saw their 10th birthday, it is likely that half or even more of their original number were gone. These are not numbers of catastrophe, of plague or famine, though those events would spike the graphs into terrifying peaks. These are the numbers of normalcy. This was the baseline attrition of childhood. This statistical reality was not an abstract concept for medieval parents. It was the lived texture of family life. To have 6, 8, or 10 pregnancies was not an expression of extraordinary fertility, but a biological and social necessity when the outcome of so many was so perilously uncertain. A family with 4 or 5 living children was considered large and fortunate. A tombstone showing a woman surrounded by many small, swaddled figures was not a testament to her fruitfulness, but a stark ledger of her grief. This shadow shaped behavior in profound, psychological ways that can feel alien to us. Affection was deep, but it was often guarded. The investment of the heart was made cautiously, incrementally, as a child passed each precarious milestone. There was a Chapter 3. The first and greatest peril, childbirth. The journey of a medieval child toward the statistical gauntlet began in the most dangerous place imaginable: the womb and the passage out of it. For the mother, childbirth was the single most lethal event of her life. For the child, it was the first and most profound crisis, a traumatic transition from a fluid, protected darkness into a world of shock, cold, and invisible threat. The moment of birth was not a medical event overseen by specialists. It was a domestic crisis, a primal and perilous passage. The setting was the home, usually a dim, warm room attended by women, a midwife, female relatives, neighbors. The midwife, the wise woman, was the central figure. Her skill was empirical, passed down through generations, a mixture of practical knowledge, herbal lore, and ritual. She knew how to palpate a belly, to sometimes turn a baby in the womb, to encourage labor with certain teas or walking. Her tools were her hands, oils, and prayer. But her arsenal against true catastrophe was heartbreakingly empty. For the mother, the dangers were stark and common: obstruction, hemorrhage, infection. If the baby was too large or positioned wrongly, there were no surgical options to save both lives. The child might be extracted in pieces with a hook, a horrific last resort, or both mother and child would die from exhaustion and trauma after days of fruitless labor. Hemorrhage after the birth was a swift and unstoppable killer, a life bleeding out into the straw in minutes, while the attendants stood helpless. And then, days later, puerperal fever, childbed fever, could strike. An infection introduced during the birth process would ignite a systemic fire, marked by chills, agonizing pain, and a foul discharge, leading to delirium and death. The door to the womb, once a passage for life, had become a gateway for sepsis. For the infant, the perils were just as immediate. The cord was cut with a non-sterile knife. The furs. Chapter 4. When the womb itself was a battlefield. Even before the trials of birth, the environment of the womb was not the secure fortress we imagine. The mother's body was the child's entire world, and that world was under constant strain. A woman of childbearing age was, in a very real sense, a landscape of depletion. Her own nutritional status, taxed by the relentless cycle of pregnancy and lactation, directly shaped the vitality of the life she carried. The medieval diet, as we have heard, was often precarious. For the poor, it was monotonous and could be deficient in crucial building blocks. A mother suffering from chronic malnutrition or acute deficiencies from the hungry gap of late winter was building a child with compromised materials. The calcium for bones, the iron for blood, the general vitality needed for robust organs, all were drawn from her own overtaxed reserves. A child could be born small, weak, and inherently more vulnerable, not from a specific disease, but from a simple, silent lack. The womb was not a shield against the world's scarcity. It was its direct conduit. Furthermore, the mother's body was itself a field of conflict with the very parasites and chronic infections that plagued daily life. The roundworms in her gut competed with the fetus for nutrients. A low-grade fever or a persistent cough from a respiratory infection was a shared burden. There was no placental barrier against the general state of her health. Her fatigue was the child's fatigue. Her anemia could become the child's frailty. The child did not float in serene isolation. It was anchored to a body engaged in its own daily struggle for equilibrium in a demanding world. This was compounded by the sheer frequency of pregnancy. With no reliable contraception, a woman might experience 10, 12, or more pregnancies in her lifetime. This meant her body had little time to recover. Each successive pregnancy drew from a well that was not being refilled. The later chilled her. Chapter 5. The midwife's limited arsenal. When labor commenced, authority passed into the hands of the midwife. She was a figure of profound importance, yet her power resided in tradition and experience, not in science or technology. She entered the birthing chamber not as a clinician with an array of tools, but as a seasoned guide into a well-known but perpetually dangerous wilderness. Her arsenal was one of persuasion, ritual, and herbal comfort, tragically insufficient against the mechanical and microbial realities of childbirth. Her primary tools were her hands. With them, she would palpate the mother's abdomen, assessing the position of the child through the wall of the womb. She might attempt external versions, manipulating the belly to try to turn a breech baby. A maneuver that required immense skill and carried its own risks. Her knowledge of anatomy was practical, not academic, learned from attending countless births and from the occasional grim opportunity to examine the dead. For pain, she had no analgesics. She might offer sips of wine or ale, or herbal infusions meant to soothe and strengthen. Teas of raspberry leaf or chamomile were common. But these were gentle nudges against a force of nature. The pain of labor was an absolute, a tempest the mother had to endure with raw fortitude, supported only by the comforting pressure of the midwife's hands and the murmured encouragements of the women in the room. To hasten a slow labor, she might use herbal stimulants like ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, which could induce powerful uterine contractions. But the dosage was guesswork. Too little did nothing. Too much could cause violent, tetanic contractions that threatened to tear mother and child apart. It was a dangerous gamble with a natural poison. Against obstruction, her options were brutal and horrific. If the child could not be born and was believed to be dead, she might use a crochet hook, a sharp, hooked instrument to dismember the fetus within. Chapter 6. The Ghost of Puerperal Fever. The birth was over. The child, by some mercy, was alive and whole. The mother had survived the torrent of labor. For a few days, there might even be a fragile sense of triumph. The mother would lie in the darkened room, the lying-in chamber, attended by women who brought her strengthening broths and helped her with the new infant. Then, on the third or fourth day, the ghost would arrive. It began with a chill, a profound, shaking cold that no amount of blankets could soothe. Then would come the fever, a dry, consuming heat that seemed to blaze up from the very core of the womb. The pain returned, not the productive pain of labor, but a deep, sickening ache in the abdomen. The lochia, the normal post-birth discharge, would turn foul, taking on a putrid, fishy stench that filled the room. The unmistakable signature of the ghost. This was childbed fever, puerperal fever. And it was a death sentence. No one knew what caused it. There were theories, of course. It was a miasma, a bad air that had seeped into the birth chamber. It was an imbalance of the humors, a surfeit of heat left over from the pregnancy. It was a punishment from God, or the work of malicious fairies who envied the new life. The treatments were as misguided as the theories. Cooling the patient with wet cloths, administering purgatives to clear the corrupted humors, bleeding her to reduce the feverish heat. These interventions, in their well-intentioned violence, often hastened the end. The true cause was on the hands of the midwife and the attendants, in the linen used to stem the bleeding, in the very air of a room where other sick persons had been. It was bacteria, most commonly Streptococcus, introduced into the raw, open wound of the uterus where the placenta had detached. The birth canal, stretched and torn, was a highway into the bloodstream. Once the infection took hold, it became systemic, a septic poisoning that raged through the body. The mothers. Chapter 7. If mother's milk failed. The infant's first and most vital lifeline was not a cord of silver or a spoon of medicine. It was the mother's breast. Her milk was more than food. It was a tailored elixir of fat, sugar, and, most crucially, the mother's own antibodies. A transfer of temporary immunity in a world swarming with pathogens. For the first months of life, it was the child's primary defense against the siege. But this lifeline was terrifyingly fragile. The failure could come from the mother's side. She might die, as we have seen, from childbirth or the fever that followed. She might be too weak or too ill to produce milk. Her own malnutrition could result in a thin, inadequate supply, leaving the infant constantly hungry and undernourished. There were also beliefs and practices that could interfere. Some thought colostrum, the first, thick yellow milk, was impure or indigestible, and it would be expressed and discarded, robbing the newborn of its most concentrated immunological gift. If the mother's milk failed, the options were dire and perilously limited. The family faced an urgent crisis. The infant could not digest cow's or goat's milk properly. Its proteins and fats were different, often causing severe digestive upset, diarrhea, and malnutrition. Attempts were made to create substitutes. Pap was a common resort, a thin gruel of breadcrumbs or flour cooked in water or animal milk, sometimes sweetened with honey. It was fed to the infant from a spoon, or from a makeshift pap boat, or even from a rag soaked in the mixture and given to suck. This pap was nutritionally inferior. It lacked the perfect balance of human milk and, more importantly, it carried none of the mother's immunological protection. It was also a vector for infection. The water used could be contaminated. The bread could be moldy. The utensils were not sterile. Feeding an infant with pap was like sending a knight into battle without armor, and giving him a sword that might BR. Chapter 9: The Constant Scourge. Diarrheal Diseases. If one had to name the single greatest reaper of medieval children, it would not be plague or famine or the sword. It would be water, or rather what was in the water. The most relentless, commonplace killer was diarrheal disease. It was not a dramatic plague that struck in waves, but a constant, quiet background hum of mortality, a thief that worked with terrifying speed and efficiency on the smallest bodies. The causes were as mundane as they were inescapable. A sip from a contaminated well, where seepage from a nearby midden had poisoned the groundwater. A piece of fruit washed in a polluted stream. A hand, grimy from play, placed in the mouth. The pathogens, bacteria like E. coli, Shigella, Salmonella, or protozoa like Giardia, were ubiquitous, woven into the fabric of daily life. For an adult with a mature system, such an infection might mean a few days of acute discomfort. For an infant or a small child, it was a life-threatening crisis. The mechanism of death was dehydration, a simple and horrifying draining. The child's body, already small and with limited fluid reserves, would attempt to purge the invader. Violent, watery diarrhea would begin. Vomiting often accompanied it. Within hours, the child would grow listless. The fontanelle, the soft spot on a baby's skull, would sink inwards, a telltale sign of the fluid vanishing from within. The eyes would become dull and dry. The skin would lose its elasticity, staying tented when pinched. The tiny body was quite literally evaporating. There was no understanding of this process. It was not seen as a catastrophic loss of fluid and electrolytes, but as a flux or a gripping of the bowels, a humor out of balance. The treatments were misguided attempts to stop the purge. Astringent herbs like blackberry root or dried bilberries might be given. Opiates to paralyze the gut were a dangerous gamble. The very idea of forcing the child to drink more of the CL. Chapter 8. The Wet Nurse. A risky substitute. When a mother's milk was absent, the search began for another woman's. The wet nurse was a figure of both salvation and profound risk, a necessary stranger upon whose body and character an infant's life depended. Hiring her was not a simple matter of convenience. It was a desperate gamble, a transfer of the most fundamental parental duty to an unknown variable. The ideal wet nurse was a young, healthy woman who had recently lost her own child. Her milk was believed to be in season, strong and flowing. She would be examined for her physical demeanor. Clear eyes, good color, firm breasts. But the examination was superficial. There was no test for the pathogens she might carry. Tuberculosis could be passed through her milk. Syphilis, though its mechanisms were not understood, could be transmitted. Her own diet and health directly affected the quality of the milk. If she was poorly nourished herself, her milk would be thin, a bluish starveling's milk that would fail to sustain the infant. Even if she was physically healthy, her circumstances introduced danger. She was often a poor woman needing the wages. She might have other children of her own to care for, dividing her attention and her nutritional resources. The infant would be sent to live in her home, or she would come to live in the employer's household, but either way it entered a new environment with different hygiene, different air, different germs. There was also the psychological and moral dimension, heavily weighed by medieval authorities. It was believed a woman's milk carried not just physical nourishment, but her very character. A wet nurse who was fearful, melancholic, or of low morals was thought to pass these traits to the child through her milk. Treatises advised selecting a woman of good temper and respectable standing, another layer of anxious scrutiny in a process already fraught with biological peril. For the wet nurse's own child, if it. Chapter 11. The Invisible Enemy. Lack of sanitation. The enemy had no face, no banner, no battle cry. It was simply the absence of a concept, the separation of waste from life. The medieval world did not lack effort or ingenuity, but it lacked the foundational principle of sanitation. The result was not merely dirtiness, but a state of perpetual biological entanglement, where the byproducts of human existence were recycled directly back into the pathways of living, eating, and breathing. Human and animal waste was not a distant problem to be processed. It was a present logistical issue. In towns, chamber pots were emptied from upper windows into the street with the famous, half-hearted cry of "Gardaloo," a corruption of "Guard a low," or "Watch out for the water." The streets were open sewers, with central gutters meant to carry the slurry away during rain, but which often stagnated, baking in the sun or freezing in fetid ice. In the countryside, the midden, the refuse heap, was a permanent feature near the dwelling, a slowly composting mountain of food scraps, ash, and excrement that fertilized the flies and seeped into the soil. This lack of separation meant that the cycle of contamination was short and vicious. A farmer would collect this human waste, this night soil, and spread it on his fields to nourish his crops. The parasite eggs and bacterial spores within it would then coat the vegetables, the lettuces, the cabbages, the roots. These would be harvested, often imperfectly washed in contaminated water, and eaten. The worms would hatch inside the new host, and their eggs would return to the midden, completing the cycle. The food chain was a closed loop of infection. Within the home, the boundaries were just as porous. Earthen floors were strewn with rushes or straw, which absorbed spills, food droppings, and animal mess. This bedding was changed infrequently, perhaps seasonally, creating a damp, organic mat that fermented beneath their feet. Fleas, lick. Chapter 10. The Deadly Cup, Water as a Poison. Water was not life, not in any safe, reliable sense. It was a necessary poison, a clear, deceptive liquid that held death in suspension. The medieval child learned thirst not as a simple call for refreshment, but as a dilemma. To drink was to gamble. To refuse was to weaken. Every cup presented a choice between the slow drain of dehydration and the swift, violent hazard of contamination. There was no source that could be trusted. The well in the village square was a communal resource, its water drawn up in a wooden bucket on a creaking rope. But the ground around it was trodden by animals and people. Latrines and waste pits were dug at what was considered a safe distance, but groundwater does not respect such boundaries. The well was a dark, stone-lined throat, drinking from the same earth that received the village's filth. Streams and rivers were worse. They were the arteries of waste disposal. Upstream, a tanner soaked hides in a toxic brew of urine and oak bark. A butcher washed blood and offal into the current. A household emptied its chamber pots off the bank. By the time the water reached a child cupping their hands downstream, it was a dilute broth of effluent. To call it dirty is to underestimate the case. It was biologically active, a culture medium for invisible killers. Even collected rainwater, caught in a barrel, was not safe. It fell through air thick with smoke, dust, and the exhalations of 1,000 chimneys. It lay stagnant, a perfect breeding ground for mosquito larvae, which carried their own dangers. The container itself might be contaminated. The concept of sterilizing a vessel simply did not exist. The result was that water, in its pure form, was largely shunned as a direct drink by those who could afford an alternative. Small beer, a very low-alcohol, lightly fermented grain beverage, was the daily drink of all ages, because the brewing process involved boiling, which killed some pathogens. Chapter 12. Streets of Filth, Homes of Miasma. If the lack of sanitation was the principle, the street was its most vivid sermon. To walk through a medieval town was not merely to navigate a pathway of stone and dirt. It was to traverse an open, festering wound. The ground underfoot was not inert. It was an active compost of daily life, and its odors were the palpable breath of decay. After a rain, the scene was most plainly declared. What had been dust and dried refuse became a viscous, flowing slurry. This rivulet gathered the leavings of stables, the ash from hearths, fish scales from the market, vegetable trimmings, and the omnipresent contributions of dogs, pigs, and other scavenging animals into a single brown stream. It would seek the central gutter, but in its passage, it coated the lower steps of houses, seeped into ground-floor workshops, and left a tittle-line of debris when it receded. The smell after a rain was not of clean earth, but of a profound, damp stirring of the town's fundament. In drier times, traffic performed a constant grinding. Cart wheels and thousands of leather-shod feet acted as millstones, pulverizing the organic refuse into a fine, pervasive powder. This dust was inescapable. It coated the bread at the market stall if left uncovered. It settled in the water of the public trough. It filmed the skin and was inhaled with every breath, carrying a gritty, particulate taste of the street's composite filth onto the tongue and into the lungs. And this was the theory of miasma made manifest. People believed the air itself could become sick, corrupted by these foul smells. They were not entirely wrong. The stench of rot and excrement indicated the presence of the very bacteria and parasites that caused disease, though the mechanism was misunderstood. The bad air was thought to be the direct cause, rather than a fellow traveler with the true invisible agents. So the foul street was not just unpleasant. In the medieval mind, its very arrow. Chapter 14. The burden of intestinal parasites. Within the small body, unseen and largely unfelt, a parallel world thrived. It was a world of silent inhabitants, of boarders who paid no rent but took their sustenance directly from their host. Intestinal parasites were not an occasional misfortune. They were a near-universal condition of medieval existence, a chronic, draining companionship that began in early childhood and often lasted a lifetime. The pathways for this infestation were as simple as they were inescapable. The microscopic eggs of parasites like the roundworm, Ascaris lumbricoides, were passed in human feces. This waste, used as fertilizer or simply contaminating the soil and water, coated the roots of vegetables and seeped into wells. A child eating a poorly washed carrot or drinking from a contaminated cup would ingest the eggs. In the warm, dark environment of the gut, they would hatch. The larvae would then begin a bizarre and gruesome migration, burrowing through the intestinal wall, traveling via the bloodstream to the lungs, crawling up the bronchial tubes to be coughed up and swallowed again, finally maturing into foot-long, pale worms that took up residence in the intestines, competing with their young host for every scrap of nourishment. Other parasites were less dramatic but equally debilitating. Whipworms embedded their thin heads in the lining of the large intestine, causing bleeding and diarrhea. Pinworms, whose nocturnal migrations to lay eggs around the anus caused a maddening, relentless itch, led to lost sleep, irritation, and further contamination from scratching. The physical effects of this constant parasitic load were a dull, chronic drain. Abdominal discomfort, bloating, and intermittent diarrhea were simply facts of life, the background hum of a shared body. Malnutrition was a double specter. A child could be eating what seemed like sufficient food, but a significant portion of its vital nutrients was being diverted to. Chapter 13. The unwashed hand. The hand was the primary tool of existence. It plucked vegetables from the soil, kneaded dough, tended animals, guided a spoon to the mouth and wiped a runny nose. It was also inevitably a vector. The concept of hand-washing, as a deliberate act of hygiene to prevent sickness, did not exist. Hands were cleaned for social or aesthetic reasons, to remove visible dirt before a meal or after a filthy task, but not from an understanding of microscopic contamination. Water was often suspect, and soap, a harsh, fatty substance made from ash and animal tallow, was a luxury used for laundry or bathing the whole body on rare occasions, not for a quick rinse. So the child's hands, like everyone else's, were a living record of the day. After playing in the street, they might be grimed with the dust of manure and refuse. After helping in the kitchen, they bore the residues of raw meat, soil from vegetables, or the stickiness of honey. After using the privy, they were wiped on a cloth or on straw or simply on their own tunic. There was no antibacterial soap, no sink. A quick rub on wool, a dip in a basin of murky water shared by the household. This was the extent of cleansing. This meant that every meal was an inoculation. The bread held in the hand absorbed the grime from the palm. The piece of cheese picked up traces of whatever the fingers had touched last. The apple, even if rinsed in a bucket, was handled by unclean hands after its washing. The child was constantly, passively ingesting the environment. A harmless activity like digging in the garden could, hours later, lead to a fever, as soil-borne pathogens hitched a ride from under a fingernail to the digestive tract. For infants, the danger was even more direct. They explored the world by putting everything in their mouths: toys, their own fingers, the hems of their parents' tunics. Every object was a potential delivery system for the pathogens that coated their domestic world. Chapter 15. The Slow Drain of Worms. The infestation was not a single event, but a state of being. Once established, the colony of worms became a permanent, shadow economy within the child's body, operating on a relentless logic of consumption. This was not a dramatic illness with a crisis and a resolution. It was a slow, pervasive leak of vitality, a constant tax on every meal, a drain on the very energy needed for growth and play. The adult roundworms nestled in the small intestine were direct competitors. They consumed the partially digested food meant for their host. The nutrients a peasant family struggled to provide, the calories from coarse bread, the scant proteins from beans or occasional cheese, were siphoned off before they could be fully absorbed by the child's own starving tissues. The child could eat a bowl of porridge and remain hungry, their body signaling a lack that the worms had already satisfied for themselves. This led to a specific, cruel form of malnutrition. The belly might paradoxically appear swollen and distended from the mass of worms and inflammation, while the limbs grew thin and spindly, the ribs prominent. The whipworms and other parasites that caused bleeding or chronic irritation to the gut lining created another kind of drain. A slow, occult loss of blood could lead to anemia. The child would grow pale, lethargic, short of breath. Their energy, the bright, restless energy of childhood, would be replaced by a profound lassitude. They would sit listlessly when other children played, not from ill temper, but from a simple, crushing lack of physiological resources. Their world shrank not to the horizons of field and forest, but to the few feet around the hearth, because that was all the energy they could muster. This chronic debilitation made them exquisitely vulnerable. A body already struggling to maintain its own basic functions had no reserve, no defensive depth. When an acute infection did arrive, a winter cough, a summer. Chapter 17. The Hearth's Hidden Danger. The hearth was the heart of the home. It was light, warmth, and the means to cook food. Families gathered around it. Lives orbited it, and children were drawn to its flickering, elemental dance. But this vital center held a multitude of perils, each capable of turning the source of comfort into an instrument of catastrophe. The most obvious was the flame itself. There were no safety guards. A toddler learning to walk could tumble directly into the fire. A loose sleeve or a trailing hem could catch a spark and ignite. Severe burns were common, and their treatment was primitive. Herbal salves, honey, or butter might be applied, but without sterile dressings or skin grafts, a serious burn could easily become a gateway for a massive, fatal infection. The scar of a childhood encounter with the hearth was a lifelong brand, a testament to a danger ever present in the domestic sphere. Then there was the smoke, the constant, slow poison. As we have heard, it damaged lungs. But acute smoke inhalation was another risk. On a damp day when the wind blew down the smoke hole, the single room could fill with a choking, acrid fog. Eyes would stream, throats would burn, and the already vulnerable respiratory systems of children would be overwhelmed, leading to coughing fits and respiratory distress. The very structure of the hearth posed a threat. It was often built on a packed earth floor or on a stone base, but the heat could crack stones or ignite nearby wooden beams over time. A poorly maintained hearth could be the source of a house fire, the ultimate domestic nightmare that could consume home, possessions, and lives in minutes, especially in tightly packed urban quarters. But perhaps the most insidious danger of the hearth was invisible carbon monoxide. On a cold, still night, with shutters closed tight against the winter, the burning fuel could consume the available oxygen and produce this colorless, odorless gas. Family SL. Chapter 16. Respiratory Infections in a Smoky World. The air itself was an irritant. From the moment a child drew its first breath, Its lungs were introduced to an atmosphere thick with particulates. The primary source within the home was the hearth. In peasant cottages and even in many larger homes, ventilation was poor. Smoke from burning wood, peat, or dried dung curled from the fire, filling the room before finding its way out through a hole in the roof or a small, high window. The air was perpetually hazy, carrying a constant, low-level scent of wood smoke that seeped into hair, clothing, and the very walls. To live was to breathe this smoky medium. This constant exposure was a chronic assault on the delicate tissues of a child's respiratory system. The cilia, the tiny hairs that help clear mucus and debris from the airways, were paralyzed and damaged by the soot and tars. The lungs themselves were stained over time. But more immediately, this irritation made the airways raw and vulnerable. An inflamed bronchial tube is a fertile ground for infection. Then came the cold. Medieval dwellings were drafty. Chills seeped through wattle and daub walls, under doors, through shutters. The child would often sleep in close proximity to the hearth for warmth, but other parts of the home, or the journey to the privy outside, exposed them to sharp shifts in temperature. A body already coping with the abrasive smoke found its defenses further stressed by the cold. Into this compromised system, pathogens found easy passage. Crowded living conditions meant that coughs and sneezes traveled swiftly from one family member to another. A simple common cold virus, which today might mean a week of sniffles, could, in the medieval child, descend rapidly into the territory of bronchitis or pneumonia. The inflamed, soot-weakened airways could not effectively clear the mucus produced by the infection. It would pool, become a breeding ground for bacteria, and consolidate into a deep. Chapter 18, Pneumonia, the quiet killer. It often began with something small. A winter chill, a runny nose, a cough caught from a sibling. For a few days, the child might be listless, feverish, but it seemed the ordinary course of things. Then, a change would occur. The cough would deepen, becoming less frequent but more meaningful. A wet, hollow sound that seemed to come from a deeper place within the small chest. The fever would not break. Instead, it would burn more steadily. The child's breathing would become an event. You could see the effort in the flaring of the nostrils, the slight tug at the neck with each inhalation. A quiet, rhythmic grunt might accompany each exhale. This was the descent into pneumonia, and it was a quiet, efficient killer. The medieval mind had no concept of the lungs' tiny air sacs becoming flooded with pus and fluid. They saw a profound imbalance, a corruption of the vital spirits associated with breath, often blamed on an excessive cold, wet phlegm that had settled in the chest. The treatments were aimed at correcting this imbalance. Warming poultices of mustard seed or onion would be applied to the chest to draw out the cold. Expectorant syrups made from honey, vinegar, and harsh herbs like horehound were given to try to loosen the congestion. The child might be bled to reduce the feverish heat thought to be cooking the phlegm. None of these interventions addressed the infection blooming in the lung tissue. Instead, the bleeding weakened the patient further. The poultices were a superficial comfort. As the pneumonia consolidated, turning a portion of the lung into a dense, airless mass, the body's struggle for oxygen became desperate. The child's lips might take on a bluish tinge, a sign of cyanosis, of oxygen starvation. They would become delirious from fever and hypoxia, their mind drifting away even as their body fought for air. The final stages were often deceptively calm. The fierce struggle would sometimes ease as exhaust. Chapter 19, Common Diseases, Uncommon Lethality. The diseases that shaped a medieval childhood were, for the most part, not exotic plagues. They were the ordinary seasonal maladies that still circulate today. Measles, mumps, chickenpox, whooping cough, scarlet fever. But in the medieval world, these familiar names were not associated with itchy rashes, puffy cheeks, and a week off school. They were names of mortal peril, childhood scourges that cut through populations of the young with a grim and predictable efficiency. This deadliness was due to two converging factors. First was the concept of a virgin soil population. These viruses encountered immune systems that had no prior exposure, no inherited memory of the fight. When measles entered a village, it did not meet a mix of immune adults and partially protected children. It met a uniform, defenseless host population, particularly among the young. The virus could thus burn with unchecked ferocity, its complications pneumonia, encephalitis, severe dehydration, striking down a high percentage of those it infected. Second, and more crucially, these diseases attacked bodies that were already compromised. The child contracting measles was not a healthy, well-nourished modern child. They were likely burdened by intestinal parasites, mildly anemic, their respiratory tracts chronically irritated by smoke, and possibly underweight from seasonal scarcity or poor nutrition. Their immune system was not a rested, trained army. It was a ragged militia, already engaged on multiple fronts. When a powerful, new enemy like the measles virus arrived, this exhausted defense often crumbled. The disease could rage through their system, and the child would succumb not necessarily to the virus itself, but to the bacterial pneumonia that seized the opportunity in its devastated wake, or to the sheer physical collapse their frail constitution could not withstand. Furthermore, there were no supportive care protocols. Dehydration. Chapter 21. Whooping cough. The cough that kills. It began innocuously, like a common cold. A runny nose, a slight fever, a mild, dry cough. For a week or two it seemed unremarkable. Then, the character of the illness would shift, revealing its true, horrific nature. The cough would change. It would come in violent, rapid-fire paroxysms. A series of hacking, desperate coughs, one after another, so rapid the child could not draw breath in between. The face would turn dark red, then purple with the strain. The eyes would bulge. The child would appear to be suffocating from the inside out. This was the paroxysmal stage of pertussis, whooping cough. At the end of the fit, when the lungs were utterly empty, the child would finally gasp in a long, desperate breath through a windpipe narrowed by inflammation. This inhalation often produced the characteristic high-pitched whoop sound, a strident, whistling cry that gave the disease its name and signaled the end of a single bout. Then, exhausted, the child might vomit the contents of their stomach or simply collapse, spent. But the respite was temporary. The paroxysms could be triggered dozens of times a day, by anything. Cold air, eating, drinking, exertion, or even a sudden fright. There was no effective treatment. Soothing syrups and herbal steam were little more than gestures against such a violent neurological and muscular spasm. The child lived in a state of perpetual traumatic exhaustion, their small body battered by the force of its own uncontrollable reflexes. The mechanisms of death were multiple. The sheer physical violence could cause broken ribs, hernias, or bleeding in the eyes and brain from the pressure. The constant vomiting led to severe malnutrition and dehydration. But the most common killer was the interruption of breathing itself. During a severe paroxysm, the child could simply be unable to draw a breath for so long that they suffered fatal hypoxia. Their brain and heart starved of oxygen. Chapter 20. Measles in a virgin population. When the measles came to a village, it did not arrive as a minor illness. It arrived as a silent, atmospheric shift, followed by a visible storm. The first sign might be a single child with a fever and red eyes in a neighboring hamlet. Then, within weeks, it would be everywhere. In a population with no herd immunity, the virus found limitless fuel. It burned through the young with a swift, terrible efficiency that modern epidemiology struggles to imagine. The progression in a medieval child was often swift and severe. The high fever was debilitating on its own, but in a body already nutritionally marginal, it could trigger a metabolic crisis. The characteristic rash was not an external curiosity. It was a sign of internal vascular inflammation. The real danger, however, lay in the virus's immunosuppressive effect. For a period of weeks, it partially disabled the very system needed to fight it off. This opened the door wide for opportunistic invaders. The most common killer was secondary bacterial pneumonia. The measles virus damaged the epithelial lining of the respiratory tract, stripping away the body's first line of defense. Bacteria, ever present in the smoky, crowded air, would seize the opportunity, flooding into the vulnerable lungs. What began as a viral fever would transform into a deep, consolidating pneumonia, often with a speed that left families reeling. The child who seemed merely feverish could, within days, be fighting for each wet, ragged breath. Another dire complication was encephalitis, inflammation of the brain. This could leave survivors with permanent brain damage, deafness, or blindness. But in the acute phase, it presented as violent convulsions, delirium, and coma, a terrifying neurological catastrophe for which there was no explanation and no remedy beyond desperate prayer. The social havoc was profound. It struck not just one family, but every family with young children at once. An entire. Chapter 22. Scarlet fever's grim toll. Could start with something as simple as a sore throat. But within a day or two, the nature of the illness declared itself with a dramatic and terrifying sign. A rash. It began as a flush on the chest and neck, then spread as a multitude of tiny, red bumps, giving the skin a rough, sandpaper-like texture. The face might be flushed with a characteristic pale ring around the mouth. The tongue, initially coated white, would later become swollen, red, and studded with bumps. The infamous strawberry tongue. This was scarlet fever, scarlatina, a fearsome and frequent visitor to the medieval household. The disease itself, caused by a strain of Streptococcus bacteria, was a systemic poisoner. It produced a toxin that caused the rash and the high, spiking fever that accompanied it. The fever could be profound, sending children into delirious states. But the acute phase, while dangerous, was often not the end. The true grimness of scarlet fever lay in its after-effects, its post-streptococcal sequelae. Weeks after the rash had faded and the fever broken, a child could be struck down by a new, insidious development. Rheumatic fever was one such specter. The body's immune system, confused by the earlier infection, could turn on its own tissues, particularly the heart valves. This led to a condition called valvulitis, a scarring and thickening of the delicate valves that regulate blood flow. A child who had recovered from scarlet fever could be left with a permanently damaged heart, a ticking weakness that might lead to heart failure years later, or make them an easy target for the next infection. Another dreaded sequel was acute glomerulonephritis, an inflammation of the kidneys. This could lead to kidney failure with symptoms like severe swelling and bloody urine. In an age with no dialysis, this was a slow, sure death sentence. Even without these catastrophic complications, the sheer virulence of the infection could over. Chapter 24. Miasma. The theory of bad air. When a child fell ill after playing near a swamp, or when fever swept through a household following a hot, still summer, the cause seemed evident to the medieval observer. It was in the air. Not in something in the air, but in the air itself. The very atmosphere had grown sick, corrupted, and to breathe it was to inhale disease. This was the theory of miasma, pollution or bad air. And it was the dominant explanation for epidemics and much common illness for centuries. Miasma was not an abstract idea. It was a tangible olfactory reality. It was the stench of rotting garbage in the streets, the foul odor of stagnant water in a ditch, the putrid smell of a midden heap on a warm day, the off air of a sick room. These smells were not merely unpleasant. They were understood to be the active, poisonous essence of the disease. The logic was sensory and direct. Bad smell equals bad air equals sickness. To be in a place that smelled of decay was to be in a place where the atmosphere itself was pathogenic. This theory explained patterns that observation confirmed. Why did malaria literally means bad air, strike more often in low-lying marshy areas? Clearly, the air from the swamps was poisonous. Why did cities have more disease in the hot summer? The heat drew the foul miasmas up from the garbage and waste in the streets, creating a palpable, sickly haze. Why did opening windows during a plague sometimes seem to make it worse? You were letting in the corrupt outer air. Consequently, prevention focused on avoiding or cleansing these miasmas. Wealthier people would flee cities during plague outbreaks, seeking the good air of the countryside. Within the home, fragrant herbs like rosemary, juniper, or sage would be burned to purify and overpower the bad air. Sweet-smelling flowers might be strewn on floors. Pomanders, balls of aromatic substances, were carried or worn to create a personal bubble of good scent. Chapter 23. The absence of germ theory. The true nature of the enemy was a perfect and total mystery. When a child fell ill, the world did not present a cause, only a cascade of effects. Fever, chills, vomiting, rash, pain. To explain these terrifying events, medieval society constructed elaborate and elegant frameworks of understanding. But these frameworks were built in the dark. They were philosophies of sickness, not sciences of disease. The central, organizing principle of modern medicine, that specific, invisible living organisms cause specific illnesses, was a blank space in the medieval mind. This absence was not a simple lack of information. It was the foundation of an entirely different reality. In that reality, illness was not an invasion from without, but a transformation from within. The body was seen as a microcosm, a little world governed by the same principles as the larger one. Health was a balance, a quiet harmony. Sickness was a dissonance, a storm in the internal climate. Because there was no germ theory, there was no concept of contagion as we understand it, the direct transmission of a specific pathogen from person to person. They observed that sickness could spread in households, but the mechanism was not a bacterium on a hand or a virus in a cough. It was a miasma, a corruption of the very air that hung over a place or emanated from a sick person. The smell of sickness was not a symptom. It was believed to be the carrier of the sickness itself. This is why foul odors were so feared. They were the palpable evidence of the poisoned atmosphere. It also meant there was no concept of sterilization, of killing germs. A surgeon's knife was wiped clean of visible blood, but not boiled. A bandage might be reused. The sponge in the latrine was rinsed in a communal channel. The connection between these practices and the festering of wounds or the spread of childbed fever was invisible and therefore did not exist. This fundamental ignorance. Chapter 25, Humors and Imbalances. If miasma explained the external cause of sickness, the theory of the four humors explained its internal mechanics. This was not a folk belief, but a sophisticated, ancient medical framework inherited from the Greeks, primarily Galen. It proposed that health was a state of perfect balance between four fundamental bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was associated with specific qualities, elements, seasons, and temperaments. Blood was hot and wet like spring. Phlegm was cold and wet like winter. Yellow bile was hot and dry like summer. Black bile was cold and dry like autumn. A child's body, in this view, was not attacked by external invaders, but became ill when these internal humors fell out of their natural, quiet equilibrium. Perhaps there was an excess of one, or a deficiency of another. A fever with a dry cough and red skin? This was clearly an excess of hot, dry yellow bile. A child with a runny nose, lethargy, and a wet cough? An excess of cold, wet phlegm. The symptoms were not signs of a fight against an infection, but the visible signature of the internal imbalance itself. Diagnosis, therefore, was an art of interpretation. A physician would not look for a specific germ, but would read the body's poetry. He would observe the patient's complexion, feel the quality of their pulse, was it strong and bounding or weak and thready, and most importantly, examine their urine. Urine was considered a direct window into the body's inner workings. Its color, clarity, and even taste were meticulously charted in urine wheels, complex diagrams that matched different appearances to different humoral imbalances. The patient's story and symptoms were then fitted into this humoral narrative. This system was logical, self-contained, and universally applicable. Personalized illness. Two children with what we would call the same streptococcal infection might receive different treatments. Chapter 27, Herbal Hope and Superstitious Cure. Beyond the formal logic of humors, the world of healing sprawled into a vast, shadowy realm of tradition, sympathy, and faith. Here, the line between remedy and ritual blurred completely. When a child was sick, and the humoral adjustments failed, families turned to older, deeper wells of hope. This was the domain of the wise woman, the cunning man, and the collective memory of the village. A pharmacopoeia where plants, words, and objects held power not just from their physical properties, but from their symbolism and the intent behind their use. Herbal knowledge was profound but framed by the doctrine of signatures. This was the belief that a plant's appearance revealed its purpose. Lungwort, with its spotted leaves resembling diseased lungs, was used for coughs. Walnuts, shaped like a brain, were for headaches. Yellow celandine sap was used for jaundice. The physical resemblance was a sign from God, a clue to the plant's hidden virtue. The efficacy was as much in the faith of the correspondence as in any chemical compound within the leaf. Charms and amulets were commonplace. A bag of herbs tied around a child's neck might contain lavender for protection, or rue to ward off evil spirits. Written charms, sometimes containing biblical verses or magical symbols, were folded and sewn into clothing. Certain stones were believed to have protective properties. These were not mere decorations. They were active shields, believed to create a spiritual or magical barrier against the forces of sickness, which were often perceived as supernatural. The evil eye, a witch's curse, a displeased fairy. The rituals of healing were performative. A child with whooping cough might be passed under the belly of a donkey, a sympathetic act to transfer the illness. For a fever, a nail might be driven into an oak tree to pin the heat. Spells were recited, often in a mix of Latin prayer and older pagan incantations. The Healer's Co. Chapter 26. The Limited Palette of Remedies. When a humoral imbalance was diagnosed, the physician or healer reached for a toolkit designed to physically adjust the body's internal fluids. The goal was not to treat a disease, but to correct a state of being. The remedies were, therefore, systemic and confrontational, often as taxing as the illness itself. There were no magic bullets, only broad, blunt instruments aimed at the humors. The first and most common line of correction was diet. Foods were classified by their humoral qualities. If a child had a fever, excess heat, they would be given cooling foods. Cucumbers, lettuce, melons. For a cold, phlegmatic condition, warming foods like pepper, garlic, and onions were prescribed. This was not nutritional support in our sense. It was a pharmacological use of food to bombard the system with the opposite quality of the perceived excess. If diet was insufficient, the next step was herbal medicine. The medieval pharmacopoeia was vast, compiled from ancient texts and local folklore. But the efficacy of an herb was not understood biochemically. It was assigned based on its perceived qualities. A plant that produced a cooling sensation might be used for hot conditions. A bitter herb might be used to dry up excess moisture. Preparations were crude. Teas, poultices, syrups. Dosage was guesswork, and potency varied wildly. A remedy might offer some palliative relief, or it might do nothing, or its toxicity might add a new layer of illness. When imbalance was severe, more drastic measures were employed. To reduce an excess of a humor, it had to be evacuated. This led to the widespread use of purges, emetics, and most famously, bloodletting. A child with a high fever, seen as an excess of hot blood, might be bled. The physician or barber surgeon would open a vein, often at the elbow, and let the blood flow into a bowl until the patient grew pale and faint, a state called syncope, which was believed to signify the crysi. Chapter 28. The Leech's Role. Within the humoral system, blood was not just a vital fluid. It was a temperament, a season, and a potential source of corruption. An excess of blood, particularly if it was deemed hot or plethoric, was a common diagnosis for a variety of ills, especially fevers and inflammations. To correct this, the excess had to be removed. And for a localized, controlled removal, the physician or barber surgeon turned to a living, breathing tool, the medicinal leech. The leech, Hirudo medicinalis, was not a creature of horror in this context, but a precise instrument. Its use was called hirudotherapy. The theory was elegant. The leech would attach to the specific area of the body where bad blood was thought to be congested, perhaps the temples for a headache, the chest for a pulmonary complaint, or near an inflamed wound. It would then painlessly pierce the skin with its three-jawed bite and begin to feed. As it fed, it would draw off the excess, overheated or corrupted blood, thereby relieving the pressure and restoring humoral balance. The process was seen as selective and intelligent. It was believed the leech would naturally seek out the bad blood and leave the good. The slow, steady drainage was considered far gentler and more targeted than the sudden, violent release of opening a vein with a lancet. For a child, whose small body could be devastated by the loss of a bowl of blood from venesection, a few leeches might be deemed a safer, more moderate intervention. After the leech had drunk its fill, it would detach and fall away. The bite would continue to ooze blood for hours, sometimes days, which was seen as a beneficial continuation of the cleansing process. The wound was often left open to encourage this bleeding after the leech. Of course, the practice was not without its own significant dangers. The primary risk was infection. The leech's gut harbors bacteria, including Aeromonas hydrophila, which can cause severe. Chapter 29. Prayer as a primary treatment. When the herbal draughts had been swallowed, the leeches had fallen away sated, and the child's fever still burned, the final and most profound resource was summoned. This was not a mere supplement to physical care. It was often the central pillar of the response. Medicine treated the body. Prayer treated the soul, and in a world where the boundaries between physical and spiritual affliction were indistinct, healing the soul was believed to directly affect the flesh. Prayer was not a last resort. It was a continuous, integral thread in the fabric of care. The sick room became an oratory. Family members would gather to recite the Pater Noster, the Ave Maria, and the Creed. Psalters were read aloud, the rhythmic, somber Hebrew poetry of lament and supplication filling the air. Special prayers to specific saints were invoked. Saint Blaise was the patron of throat ailments. A child with whooping cough or diphtheria would be placed under his protection. Saint Roch, depicted with a plague sore on his thigh, was invoked against pestilential fevers. Saint Margaret of Antioch was the patron saint of childbirth, and by extension of pregnant women and newborns. Their intercession was sought with desperate specificity. Relics played a direct, tactile role. A fragment of a saint's bone, a piece of their clothing, or an object they had touched, housed in a local church or monastery, might be brought to the sickbed, or the child might be taken to it. The relic was a conduit of divine grace, a physical point where the heavenly and earthly realms intersected. Touching it or being touched with it was a transfer of holy power, a direct spiritual intervention against the forces of sickness, which were often seen as demonic or divine punishment. Vows were made. A parent might pledge to go on pilgrimage to a distant shrine, to give alms to the poor, or to fast for a period if the child recovered. These were bargaining chips offered. Chapter 30. Malnutrition. The silent partner. Sickness rarely traveled alone. It was almost always accompanied by a silent, weakening partner, malnutrition. This was not necessarily the dramatic starvation of famine, though that was a periodic horror. This was a chronic, low-grade insufficiency, a persistent gap between what the body needed to grow and defend itself, and what the medieval diet and season could reliably provide. The peasant diet was a monument to calories, not completeness. Its bedrock was grain. Rye, barley, oats, wheat for the luckier few. This was consumed as a thick porridge, pottage, or as coarse, dark bread. It filled the stomach and provided energy for labor, but it was lacking. Protein was scarce. Meat was a rare luxury, perhaps at a festival or from an old animal. Dairy, in the form of cheese or whey, offered some, but it was seasonal. Legumes like peas and beans were vital, but not always plentiful. The diet was overwhelmingly carbohydrate, deficient in the building blocks for robust cell repair and a strong immune system. Then there were the vitamin deficiencies, silent and invisible. The most notorious was scurvy, from a lack of vitamin C. In the long, hungry gap of late winter and early spring, when stored grains were running low and no fresh greens had yet appeared, the body's reserves dwindled. A child might grow lethargic. Their gums would become spongy and bleed, old wounds would fail to heal, and their legs might ache. No one knew why. It was simply the spring sickness, a seasonal debility that weakened them right before the spring rains and mud brought their own host of pathogens. Rickets, from a lack of vitamin D and calcium, softened growing bones. A child's legs would bow under their own weight, their chest might become deformed, and their growth would be stunted. This was not seen as a disease of nutrition, but as a natural variation or a result of weak bones. The child would be more prone to fractures and with a co. Chapter 31. the hungry gap of late winter. The deepest silence in the medieval year was not one of sound, but of growth. It was the period between the depletion of the old harvest and the promise of the new, the months of late winter and early spring, known as the hungry gap. The granaries, if they existed, were reaching their bottom. The root vegetables stored in clamps were softening with rot or long consumed. The livestock, precious and few, were kept alive on the last of the fodder, not to be slaughtered. The land was dormant, a monochrome landscape of mud and frost offering nothing green. For the child, this was a season of profound and subtle transformation. The monotonous winter diet of grain pottage, now thinned with more water and less barley, grew even more sparse. The family meal became a ghost of itself, a watery broth where the spoon hunted for a few precious peas or a scrap of salt pork. The calories necessary for warmth, for play, for the simple act of growing, were simply not there. This was the time when the hidden deficiencies declared themselves. The body had been living on its reserves since the autumn harvest. Now those reserves were gone. Scurvy, the silent thief of vitality, began its work. The child, already listless from the cold and confinement, would grow paler, more fatigued. Their gums might bleed when they chewed the hard crust of dwindling bread. Their legs ached with a deep bone weariness. Bruises from innocent play would linger, purple and yellow, because the body lacked the resources to repair the tiny ruptured vessels. They were not acutely starving in the dramatic sense. They were withering from the inside out, their metabolic candle guttering for lack of fuel. This seasonal malnutrition was the perfect prelude to the spring's diseases. As the weather slowly warmed, pathogens thrived in the thawing mud and the still, damp air. But the child facing this microbial resurgence was at their absolute weakest. Their immune. Chapter 33. Weaning onto pap and porridge. The transition from mother's milk to solid food was not a gradual introduction of new flavors and textures. It was a perilous nutritional cliff, and the landing was often onto a substance of scant and suspect nourishment. This substance was pap, a thin, bland gruel that was the universal first food for medieval infants once breastfeeding ended, whether at a year old or, in harder circumstances, much earlier. Pap was typically made from breadcrumbs or flour, often barley or rye, the coarser, cheaper grains, soaked and cooked in water, broth, or animal milk. It might be sweetened with a drop of honey if the family could spare it. Its consistency was meant to be swallowable by a toothless infant, a semi-liquid paste. But its nutritional profile was a pale, weak ghost of breast milk. It was primarily a simple carbohydrate, lacking the balanced fats, complete proteins, and crucial immunological factors of human milk. It was empty calories designed to fill a small stomach, not to build a robust body. The dangers were manifold. First was the risk of contamination. The water or broth used could harbor pathogens. The bread or flour could be old, weevily, or contaminated with ergot fungus. The utensils and bowls were not sterilized. For an infant whose gut had only known the clean, tailored environment of breast milk, pap was a shocking introduction to the microbial wilds of the household. Second was the issue of digestion. An infant's system is not designed to handle large amounts of cereal starch so early. Pap could cause digestive upset, bloating, and diarrhea, which in turn could lead to dehydration and malabsorption of the few nutrients it did contain. The infant could appear to be eating, yet still waste away, their body unable to extract what it needed from the simple, inappropriate fuel. Third, and most critically, pap provided no defensive support. Weaning meant the sudden, total withdrawal of the mother's antib. Chapter 32. Vitamin deficiencies without names. The ailments had no true names, only descriptions of their effects. There was no concept of vitamin C or vitamin D. There were only strange, seasonal patterns of suffering that descended upon children, patterns as reliable as the failing light of winter and as mysterious as the reasons for their arrival. Take the child who grew pale and listless as the days shortened. Their appetite faded. Their legs, once strong for running, began to ache with a deep, nagging pain that made them fuss and limp. Their growth, once steady, seemed to stall. In severe cases, their bones, softened from within, would begin to bend under their own weight. The shins would curve outward, The spine might twist. The chest could become pigeon-breasted. This was rickets, but to the medieval observer, it was simply a weakness of the bones, or a child who was poorly constituted. They might blame the damp air, or a mother's melancholy during pregnancy, or simply a bad alignment of the stars. The true cause, a catastrophic lack of vitamin D, crucial for calcium absorption, compounded by long months indoors and a diet devoid of fatty fish or enriched dairy, remained a total mystery. The treatment might involve strengthening broths or, ironically, sending the child into the sunlight that could have prevented it, but only after the damage was done. Or consider the child in late winter, whose gums turned red, then purple and bled at the touch. Their skin bruised at the slightest knock, a map of purple and yellow spreading across their limbs. Old scratches refused to heal, becoming angry, open sores. They were irritable, fatigued, and their joints ached. This was scurvy. But it was known as spring sickness, or land sickness, a seasonal curse that came with the end of stored food. The idea that a lack of something specific, a substance found in fresh greens, fruits, and sprouts, was the cause was inconceivable. The cure when stumbled upon. Chapter 34. The danger of domestic accidents. The greatest threats to a child were not always microscopic. They were the physical, immediate hazards of a world built for adult labor, not child safety. The medieval home and its surroundings were a landscape of unguarded perils, where a moment's inattention could lead to a swift, irrevocable end. Supervising a child was a constant, exhausting exercise in risk management against a host of silent, structural dangers. The hearth, as we've seen, was a focal point of warmth and a font of catastrophe. But beyond the open flame, there was the boiling pot suspended over it. A curious toddler pulling on a hanging handle could bring a cascade of scalding water or stew down upon themselves, causing horrific burns that would almost inevitably become infected. Hot embers could pop from the fire onto rushes or clothing. Water was a quiet, deep threat. Wells were often simply open holes in the ground, sometimes with a low wall, but rarely a secured cover. A child peering in or chasing a ball could topple in and drown in the cold, dark shaft. Water butts and troughs for animals presented the same risk. In a society where most could not swim, a fall into a stream or pond was often fatal. The very architecture was hazardous. Steep, narrow, often ladder-like staircases in multi-story homes were treacherous. A fall could mean a broken neck or a severe head injury. Upper-story windows might have no barrier. Unstable flooring or a rotten floorboard could give way. For the very young, even the sleeping arrangement was risky. The common practice of parents and infants sharing a bed, while providing warmth, led to accidental overlay. A parent rolling over in sleep and smothering the child. This was so common it had its own grim term: overlaying. Then there were the tools of daily life. Scythes, axes, and knives were left within reach. Agricultural machinery, like mill wheels or threshing flails, were fascinating and deadly. Annam. Chapter 36. The Uncovered Well. Water was life, and the place from which it was drawn was often a mouth of death. The village well was not a sanitized, capped mechanism with a hand pump. It was typically a deep, stone-lined shaft, open to the sky, with a wooden bucket on a rope. It was a vital communal resource, and it was, in its simple construction, a perfect trap. The rim of the well was often low, perhaps just a few stones high to keep surface debris from tumbling in. For a child, this was no barrier. The well was a place of fascination. The dark circle promised coolness on a hot day. The bucket, as it was drawn up, splashed and glittered. Peering over the edge, a child could see their own faint reflection far below in the dark water. A tiny, wobbly face in a circle of stone. The danger was twofold. The first was the obvious: a fall. A child leaning over to look, chasing a dropped toy, or simply tripping on the uneven ground could plunge into the shaft. The fall itself onto the water or the bucket could be fatal. But even if survived, the well became a vertical stone tomb. The sides were often slick with algae, impossible to climb. The water was deep and cold. Drowning would be swift, and rescue, if anyone witnessed the fall, was nearly impossible without ropes and strong men to haul the victim back up the sheer, narrow chimney. The second danger was more subtle but ever-present: contamination. The open well was a catchment for everything that fell or washed in from the surrounding ground. Leaves, dead insects, rodents, and the runoff from the nearby midden or stable would all find their way into the water supply. The bucket itself, handled by many hands and often left sitting on the ground, was a vector. The water drawn from even a deep, fresh spring could be fouled at the point of collection. Yet, this was the water used for drinking, cooking, and washing, the very essence of daily life drawn from a hole that doubled as a potential grave and aguara. Chapter 35. The Unprotected Hearth. It was the center of life, and it was ringed by an invisible circle of danger. The hearth, that necessary well of heat and light, was an ever-present, unblinking eye of hazard in the medieval home. There were no fire guards, no safety gates, no concept of childproofing. The boundary between the living space and the open flame was a line drawn only in the air, by a parent's constant vigilance and a child's learned fear. For the infant learning to crawl, the flickering light was a primal attraction. The warmth drew them. The distance was nothing. A few unsteady movements on packed earth or rushes could bring them within reach of the burning logs or the bed of glowing embers. A burn from a spark or a brush against a hot stone facing was a common, painful lesson. But a more tragic misjudgment, a tumble forward into the fire itself, was a catastrophe. Such burns were often severe and covering large parts of a small body. The treatments were poultices of herbs, egg white, or bread mold. But without sterile dressings or skin grafts, infection was almost certain, and the resulting shock and sepsis were frequently fatal. The danger was not static. The fire was alive. It spat. Embers could leap from the hearth onto the dry rushes strewn across the floor, igniting a smolder that could quickly become a house fire. A child's loose woolen tunic, brushing too close, could catch a spark. The very act of tending the fire was perilous. A log shifting suddenly could send a shower of burning fragments into the room. And the hearth's threat extended beyond flame. The heavy iron cooking pot, suspended on a hook over the fire, was a vessel of scalding liquid. A child pulling on a dangling chain or rope could bring the entire contents down upon themselves. The pot itself, or the trivet it sat upon, remained searingly hot for hours after the fire had died down, a hidden brand waiting for an unwary touch. Thus, the hearth demanded a specific E. Chapter 38. The Psychology of Parental Detachment. The constant, statistical shadow of child mortality did not merely shape practical choices. It sculpted the emotional landscape of parenthood itself. To love with the abandon we consider natural was, in the medieval context, to invite a level of devastation that could shatter a person. A culture developed, not of coldness, but of a profound, protective emotional economy. Investment in a child was made cautiously, incrementally, as they passed each precarious milestone. This began with the pregnancy itself. While hoped for, a pregnancy was also a known mortal risk for the mother, and its outcome for the child was uncertain. There was often a deliberate hesitation to celebrate too soon. The birth was a crisis survived, not a guaranteed happy ending. The most vulnerable period, the first weeks and months, demanded the greatest emotional reserve. This manifested in practices that seem shocking to modern sensibilities. The late naming of children is the most cited example. Parents might wait weeks, or even until the child's first birthday, to bestow a baptismal name. To name was to make a person, to induct them into the family and the community. Why perform that act for a life that statistics said was more likely to end in the parish burial register than in the marriage banns? A generic term like little one, or a familial nickname sufficed until the child had proven its viability. This was not a lack of love, but a grim form of emotional bookkeeping. Art and literature of the period reflect this detachment. Depictions of the Holy Family show a tender but often solemn Mary and Joseph with the Christ child, a model of pious, restrained affection. The boisterous, sentimental celebration of childhood was a later development. Children were often portrayed in art as miniature adults, their mortality and distinct psychology less emphasized. This does not mean medieval parents did not grieve. Will's Personal Letters. Chapter 37. The Peril of the Shared Bed. Warmth was survival, and in the deep cold of a medieval winter, preserving body heat was a ruthless arithmetic. Fuel was expensive, blankets were few, and walls were drafty. The solution was simple and universal. People slept together. Parents, children, infants, and sometimes even servants or animals shared sleeping spaces, piling onto straw-filled mattresses or simple pallets on the floor. This practice, born of necessity, carried with it a silent, suffocating risk. The greatest danger was to the smallest. An infant would sleep between its parents or nestled against its mother's side, enveloped in the shared warmth of adult bodies. But an exhausted parent, deep in the sleep of physical labor, could roll over. A heavy arm, a shift in position, could cover the infant's face. The child, too weak to cry out or struggle effectively, could be smothered in the very embrace meant to protect it. This accident was so common it had a specific name: overlaying. It was a private, intimate tragedy that happened in the dark, a death delivered not by disease or violence, but by the loving, unconscious weight of a parent's body. Beyond this acute danger, the shared bed was a vector. Respiratory illnesses passed effortlessly in the moist, confined air of shared breath throughout the night. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs traveled from one body to another, bringing irritation, lost sleep, and sometimes disease like typhus. There was no concept of quarantine, of isolating the sick. The ill child would remain in the family bed, their coughs and feverish exhalations becoming part of the air everyone breathed. The bed itself was rarely clean. Straw mattresses, changed perhaps once a year, became compacted, damp, and home to a thriving ecosystem of mites and pests. Bedding was infrequently washed. In such an environment, a minor skin infection on one child could quickly spread to others through direct contact. Thus, the shared bed that sy. Chapter 39. The late naming tradition. The act of naming was not a simple formality following birth. It was a powerful rite of incorporation, a spiritual and social contract. To give a child a name, especially the Christian name received at baptism, was to formally introduce a new soul to God, to the community, and to the lineage of the family. It was an act of profound commitment. And so, in the face of overwhelming odds, many parents hesitated. The delay could be weeks, months, or even a year or more. During this time, the infant was referred to by generic terms, the babe, the little one, or perhaps a descriptive nickname based on appearance or behavior. This was a period of probation, a waiting game played against the grim statistics of infant mortality. The first year was the most dangerous. If the child could survive that, their chances improved dramatically. To confer a name before this trial was seen by some as tempting fate, as investing too much of the family's spiritual and emotional capital in a venture that was all too likely to fail. Baptism itself was urgent, usually within days of birth, for the Church taught that an unbaptized soul could not enter heaven. But this baptismal name was sometimes provisional. In some records, we find children listed with a name, and then later, if they survived, that name might be changed or confirmed at a later ceremony. The urgency was for the soul's safety. The formal naming was for the person's place on earth. This practice was not universal. It varied by region, class, and period, but where it existed, it was a stark cultural admission of helplessness. It acknowledged that parents did not have the power to ensure their child's survival through love or will alone. It was a strategy of emotional risk management. The death of an unnamed little one was a tragedy, but it was a different order of loss than the death of a named son, an Ethelred or a Matilda, who had been woven into the family's story. And Chapter 41. The high stakes of a large family. In a world where half of all children might die before adulthood, simple arithmetic dictated strategy. To ensure the survival of a few children to continue the family line, work the land, and provide support in old age, you had to start with many. A large family was not an expression of unchecked fertility or simple joy. It was a demographic imperative, a grim form of biological insurance. For a peasant family tied to a plot of land, children were both a short-term burden and a long-term necessity. They were mouths to feed with scarce resources, but they were also the future labor force. A son could take over the plow. A daughter could bring a dowry or marry into a neighboring family, creating alliances. In old age, with no pension or social security, surviving children were the only safety net. Therefore, producing many offspring was a rational economic calculation, despite the immense physical toll on the mother and the strain on the household. This created a relentless cycle for women. Marriage often came soon after puberty. From that point, a woman could expect to be pregnant or nursing for most of her childbearing years. Each pregnancy was a risk to her life. Each birth added another fragile life to the household, starting the anxious vigil anew. The goal was not necessarily to raise 8 children, but to have 8 pregnancies in the hope that 3 or 4 might live to adulthood. The lost children were, in this harsh calculus, the tragic cost of doing business, the inevitable wastage in a system where the final yield was always uncertain. For the children themselves, life in a large family was one of intense competition for limited resources. Parental attention, food, warmth, and care were divided many ways. The youngest and weakest, often those born to an already depleted mother, were at a profound disadvantage. They might receive less food, less care during illness, simply because the parents enter. Chapter 40, Grief as a Frequent Guest. Sorrow was not a stranger who arrived in dramatic, singular catastrophe. It was a familiar, if unwelcome, guest in the medieval household. Its visits were so frequent that a space was reserved for it in the rhythm of life, in the rituals of the community, and in the very architecture of the heart. The loss of a child was not the unthinkable, world-shattering rupture it often is today. It was a deeply painful but expected part of the human condition. This expectation shaped the experience of grief. It did not make it less painful, but it gave it a known shape, a path to walk. The community understood. Neighbors would have undergone the same loss. The church provided the structure. The small coffin, the brief, formulaic funeral rite, the burial in the churchyard, often in a section for the unbaptized or the very young. There was a script to follow when words failed, which they often did. This communal recognition prevented the isolation that magnifies modern grief. The grief was also, in a terrible way, amortized. When loss is a constant possibility, the heart cannot afford to invest all its capacity for love and hope into a single, fragile vessel. As we have heard, affection was guarded, given in increments as a child passed each milestone. This meant that when death came, the devastation, while profound, was not always total. There was often another child in the cradle, or one soon to come. The emotional energy, the care, the hope had to be transferable. This is not to say children were interchangeable. Personal letters and wills show they were not. But the system of family life was built to withstand these repeated blows without complete collapse. This frequency also bred a kind of fatalism, a theological or philosophical framing. A child's death could be interpreted as God calling back a pure soul, sparing it the sins and sufferings of the world. Could be seen as a trial of faith for the parents. Could be blamed on. Chapter 42. Maternal depletion and fetal weakness. The mother's body was not an inexhaustible well. It was a resource, and in the relentless cycle of pregnancy, birth, and lactation that defined a medieval woman's life, that resource was being constantly mined with little chance for replenishment. This state of chronic maternal depletion cast a long shadow over the health of every child she bore, particularly those who came later in the sequence. Each pregnancy drew upon the mother's reserves of iron, calcium, protein, and vital energy. Her body would prioritize the growing fetus, even at her own expense. If her diet was poor, as it often was, especially for peasant women who fed the family's breadwinners first, she would become increasingly deficient. By the time of the birth, she might be anemic, her bones leaching calcium, her muscles weak. The colostrum and milk she produced for the newborn would be thinner, less rich, a diluted version of what her first child might have received. Then, if she survived the birth, lactation would continue the drain. For up to 2 years or more, her body would convert her food into milk. Only then, perhaps, would she have a brief respite before the next pregnancy began. There was no prenatal vitamin, no fortified food, no understanding of the need for specific recovery. Her body ran a marathon, then immediately began training for the next one, on a diet of porridge and grit. The consequence for the child was intrinsic weakness. A fetus developing in a depleted environment was built with inferior materials. It might be born small-fordate with less robust organs, a weaker immune system, and lower stores of essential nutrients. It was a child starting life's race already far behind, carrying a handicap conferred in the womb. Its chances of surviving the first fever, the first bout of diarrhea, were significantly lower than those of a firstborn sibling conceived when the mother was young and relatively robust. This created Chapter 44, Infanticide, the Darkest Choice. At the farthest edge of desperation, where poverty, shame, and the brutal logic of survival intersected, lay the darkest choice. Infanticide, the deliberate killing of a newborn, was a crime, a mortal sin, and a secret sorrowful reality. It was not an act of monsters, but sometimes the final, horrific calculation of people cornered by circumstance. The most common victims were newborns, often within hours or days of birth. The methods were quiet: exposure, smothering, drowning. The motivations were pitilessly practical. The child might be illegitimate, a threat to a woman's marriage prospects, or a source of unbearable family shame in a rigidly moralistic society. It might be a girl, seen in some hard-pressed families as an economic liability who would require a dowry, rather than an asset like a son who could work the land. Most bleakly, it might simply be one mouth too many in a family already starving, where the mother's milk was insufficient for the children she already had. The line between infanticide and accidental death was often blurry. Overlaying the accidental smothering of an infant in a shared bed could be a convenient, unprovable explanation. Exposure, leaving the child in a wild place or at the door of a church, could be framed as abandonment in the hope someone else would take it, though the midwinter cold usually rendered that hope a fiction. The community often suspected, but proof was nearly impossible unless the act was witnessed. The church thundered against it, and secular laws prescribed brutal punishments. But the very frequency of the sermons and statutes suggests the practice was persistent. It was the ultimate, terrible feedback of the high mortality environment. If so many children died naturally, one more death, especially of a tiny, unseen newborn, could be hidden within the grim statistics. A missing baptismal record, a small, unmarked grave, or no grave at all. To contemplate Chapter 43, The Relentless Cycle of Pregnancy. From menarche to menopause, a woman's body was not her own. It was a landscape in a state of perpetual potential or actual harvest. The concept of family planning, of spacing children for the health of mother and baby, did not exist in any reliable form. Herbal contraceptives and abortifacients were known to some, but their efficacy was uncertain and their use often dangerous or sinful. For the vast majority, sexuality led inexorably to pregnancy. A woman married in her teens could expect to be pregnant or nursing for the next 20 to 25 years, with only the brief, fragile pauses of infertility between weaning and the next conception. This cycle was not a chosen rhythm, but a biological fate. It meant a woman's life was a series of profound physical ordeals, each one risking her life, separated by periods of draining recovery and the exhausting demands of an infant or toddler. There was no time off. While she nursed one child, she might already be carrying the next. Her body never returned to a baseline state of strength and reserve. It existed in a permanent condition of depletion and demand. The psychological weight was immense. Every missed period was both a hope and a dread. It meant another mouth to feed from a pot that was already stretched thin. It meant another round of the birth lottery, with her own life as a stake. It meant the existing children would receive even less of her dwindling energy and attention. For a peasant woman, it also meant continuing hard physical labor, in the fields, at the hearth, hauling water, while pregnant and nursing, further straining her overtaxed system. For the children already born, this cycle shaped their world. They saw their mother perpetually tired, often pregnant, frequently grieving. They competed for her lap, her milk, her notice. As soon as they were able, they were put to work, helping to shoulder the burden that their very existence had helped Chapter 45, Exposure and Abandonment. A step removed from the finality of infanticide was abandonment, a desperate gamble that transferred the burden of life and death from the parent to fate, or to the conscience of a stranger. This was the act of exposure, leaving a newborn in a public place where it might, with luck, be found and taken in. It was an act of relinquishment, not always of murder, though the outcomes were often the same. The chosen locations were symbolic. The steps of a church were the most common. Here, the child was placed under the protection of God and the Christian duty of charity. The porch of a wealthy person's home was another possibility, a direct appeal to their mercy and resources. A busy market square offered the chance of discovery by many eyes. The hope, however faint, was that a childless couple, a kindly monk or nun, or a wealthy patron would take pity and raise the child. But hope was a slender thread. Exposure was most often practiced on newborns, the most vulnerable of all. Left alone, even in a relatively sheltered spot, they could perish from the cold within hours, a swift and passive death by hypothermia. Animals could find them first, or they might be discovered too late, already sickened by the exposure to the elements. The line between abandonment and a slow, indirect form of infanticide was treacherously thin. The reasons mirrored those for infanticide: extreme poverty, illegitimacy, deformity, or simply being the one child too many in a family that could not feed another mouth. A female infant was more likely to be abandoned than a male. A child born with a visible defect, believed to be an omen or a divine punishment, might be left as well. The act was a brutal form of triage, a decision that the child's chance, however small, was better entrusted to the unpredictable charity of the world than to the certain destitution of the family. The practice was so common that it shaped institutions. Foundling homes and Chapter 47. A fragile thread in a rough world. Consider the thread of a single childhood, spun from the moment of that perilous first breath. It is not a sturdy cord, but a fragile filament, vulnerable to 1,000 different kinds of friction. Each day it is tested. It rubs against the coarse, parasitic reality of the gut. It is frayed by the abrasive, smoky air drawn into developing lungs. It is weakened by the seasonal thinning of nourishment, the hungry gap where the thread grows brittle. It is snagged by the sudden, sharp dangers of the hearth, the well, the shared bed. This thread does not exist in isolation. It is one among many in the family loom, each thread under similar strain. The weaver, the parent, the mother especially, is herself a thread worn thin by relentless use, her own substance depleted by the constant work of creating and sustaining others. Her hands, though loving, are tired. Her attention, though caring, is divided. She can mend some breaks, guard against some snags, but she cannot change the rough texture of the world through which all these threads must pass. The medieval world was not malicious toward children. It was simply indifferent, and its indifference was expressed through a pervasive, unyielding roughness. There was no padding, no safety net, no intervening layer of science or social welfare between the vulnerable human body and the blunt facts of nature, biology, and economy. The world presented its challenges directly, and the body of a child was the point of first contact, the most delicate instrument forced to negotiate the harshest terms. This friction was constant. It was not the dramatic break of plague or famine, but the slow, wearing attrition of imperfect food, contaminated water, crowded quarters, and inadequate remedies. The thread was not designed to last. It was designed to be tested. Most threads broke. The miracle, the statistical outlier, was the thread that held that through some combination of robust. Chapter 46. The role of famine and war. The chronic perils of childhood existed against a backdrop that could, at any moment, turn acute and catastrophic. Two forces could transform the difficult into the impossible, the risky into the fatal. Famine and war. These were not mere additions to the list of dangers. They were multipliers, environmental shocks that overwhelmed all the fragile systems of survival at once. Famine was the great simplifier. It began with a trigger, a drought that withered the grain, torrential rains that rotted the seed in the ground, a late frost that killed the blossoms, or a blight like the potato late blight of later centuries. The harvest failed. The price of grain soared beyond the reach of the peasant. The family's meager stores were consumed. Then, the hungry gap stretched from weeks into months. For the child, famine meant the slow, systematic dismantling of their body's defenses. The pottage became water. The milk of a malnourished mother dried up. The body, starved of protein and calories, began to consume itself. Muscles wasted. The belly might swell with edema, a cruel illusion of fullness. The immune system collapsed. Now, the ever-present pathogens, the bacteria in the water, the parasites, found a host with zero resistance. Diarrheal diseases became universal and universally fatal. A simple respiratory infection became a death sentence. The children, already the most vulnerable, were the first and greatest victims. Famine did not just starve them. It unlocked every door through which death could walk in. War was a more violent, but equally effective, destroyer of the childish world. It might not be the battle itself that killed them, though that could happen. It was the consequences. Armies, whether friendly or hostile, lived off the land. They requisitioned grain stores, slaughtered livestock, and burned fields to deny them to the enemy. A marching army could strip a region bare in days, imposing an instant man-made F. Chapter 48. The Echo of Tiny Graves. If one could hear the past not as a story, but as a sound, the medieval landscape would hum with a quiet, high-frequency tremor, the echo of countless tiny graves. This was not the deafening crash of battlefields or the collective groan of famine, but a pervasive, whispered chorus. It resonated in the packed soil of the churchyard, in the corner of the field set aside for the unbaptized, in the small, unmarked mounds at the edges of settlement. The evidence is literal and skeletal. Archaeological excavations of medieval cemeteries consistently reveal a shocking proportion of burials for infants and children under the age of 10, often nearing or exceeding 50% of the total. Their bones tell silent, chemical stories. Lines of arrested growth from seasons of hunger, the porosity of scurvy, the malformations of rickets. They are small and they are many. This demographic reality shaped the soundscape of life. The lullabies sung were also dirges in waiting. The games played in the churchyard were danced over siblings. The family, as a living unit, was a shape in constant flux, with edges that were soft and permeable to loss. A household's composition at one harvest could be different by the next, not from migration, but from subtraction. The echo was also cultural and psychological. It can be heard in the medieval preoccupation with the innocence of childhood death. The idea of children as angelic or becoming chrysalis souls spared the corruption of the world. This was a necessary theology, a way to sanctify a constant, demoralizing sorrow. It can be heard in the art that depicted the massacre of the innocents with a particular, relatable horror, and in the tenderness with which the Christ child was sometimes portrayed, a rare celebration of fragile infancy itself. This echo meant that to be a medieval adult was to be a survivor, surrounded by ghosts. Your own childhood was a memory populated by the faces of T. Chapter 49. Survival as the exception, not the rule. We must invert our modern expectation. In the medieval world, death in childhood was not the shocking exception. It was the common, anticipated outcome. Survival to adulthood was the achievement, the statistical anomaly that required explanation. When a child lived, it was not simply because nothing went wrong. It was because a complex, fragile alliance of circumstances held, just barely, against the relentless pressure of a world designed to winnow. Think of it as a series of gates, each one narrowing the passage forward. The first gate was birth itself and the mother's survival. Then, the gate of the first week, establishing breastfeeding, avoiding the infections of the unsterile cord. The gate of the first year, surviving weaning onto inadequate pap, evading the fatal dehydration of summer diarrhea and the congestive lungs of winter smoke. The gate of early childhood, enduring the measles, the whooping cough, the scarlet fever, without succumbing to the pneumonia that so often followed. The gate of chronic deprivation, growing despite parasites and seasonal hunger, building bones strong enough not to bend, teeth robust enough not to rot into fatal abscesses. To pass through all these gates required a conspiracy of luck. It required being born to a mother who was, herself, relatively robust and well-nourished. It required a year without a major famine or epidemic sweeping through the village. It required a constitution genetically disposed to resist infections fiercely. It required avoiding the one misstep near the hearth, the one fatal curiosity at the well's edge. It required, in essence, a continuous 10-year run of good fortune in an environment statistically rigged for misfortune. This is why large families were necessary. It was a numbers game. By sending many threads into the loom, the odds increased that one or two would emerge unbroken on the other side. The survivors were not necessarily teach. Chapter 50. The Distance of Centuries. We have sat in the dim, smoky room. We have heard the wet cough in the small chest, felt the ache of hollow hunger in a lean season, and known the helpless dread of watching a child grow quiet as the fever burns. We have traced the fragile thread through a world of unrelenting friction. Now let us step back. Let the images soften, the specific fears blur into a general, gray sigh of the past. The details are important, but their accumulation has a single, simple purpose: to measure a distance. The space between you now and that child then is not just time. It is a chasm of experience. It is the distance between a world that abraded and a world that cushions. Your comfort is not incidental. It is the product of 1,000 quiet revolutions in thought, in science, in compassion. The clean water, the inoculated body, the painless tooth, the warm room, the full bowl. These are not trivialities. They are the walls of a fortress that has been built, brick by scientific brick, between the modern human and the raw, indifferent mechanics of survival that defined the pre-industrial world. That medieval child's life was not a historical drama. It was the universal human condition minus our defenses. Their fears were the logical, reasonable fears of a creature living in direct contact with the unmediated forces of nature and biology. Their sorrows were the expected sorrows. Their joys, when they came, were seized in the brief gaps between struggles, and were perhaps all the more piercing for that. As you drift now in your safety, let this not be a morbid meditation, but a grounding one. The past is not a quaint story. It is a country of profound fragility. The quiet you enjoy, the simple assumption of a tomorrow for the young, is a historical miracle. The siege has been lifted. The gauntlet, for most, has been dismantled. The echo of those tiny graves is faint now, heard only in old stones and dry texts.